Our lectionary scriptures over the last several weeks have been a very rich and a lot of powerful things that have come out of this part of the book of Mark. Starting over in chapter 4, there's a story about where Jesus is up under the front of a boat and him and the disciples are out on the sea, and a great storm comes up and they get scared, and Jesus comes out and calms the seas. And it's in there to show that Jesus has control over nature. Then on that trip, they go to what would be the west side of Lake Galilee. And as soon as they get off, they encounter a man who's possessed by a severe demon that has made this man so strong and mighty that no one even can control him. He can even break the chains they put him in. And Jesus orders the spirit out. And the demon is gone. And it shows Jesus' control over spirits. And then in this week, Jesus heals a woman with a severe medical condition, and it shows his power over healing. And then he raises a young girl from the dead, and it shows his control over life. So in Mark we read, Jesus went back to the other side of the lake in a boat. There was a large crowd of people gathered around him on the shore. The leader of the synagogue, his name was Jairus, he saw Jesus and bowed down before him and begged Jesus again and again, saying, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and lay your hands on her, and she'll be healed and will live." So Jesus went with Jairus, and many of the people followed Jesus, and they were pushing around closely to him. There among the people was a woman who had been bleeding for the past 12 years. She had suffered much. Many doctors had tried to help her, and all the money that she had been spent, but she was not improving, and in fact, her sickness was getting worse. The woman heard about Jesus, so she followed him with the other people and touched his coat. She thought, if I can just touch his clothes, that will be enough to heal me. As soon as she touched his coat, her bleeding stopped. She felt that her body was healed from all that suffering. Jesus immediately felt power go out from him, so he stopped and turned and said, "Who touched my clothes?" I don't think he said it that way. I think he said it more like, "Who touched my clothes?" The followers said to Jesus, "There's so many people pushing against you, but you say, 'Who touched my clothes?'" And Jesus kept looking for the one who touched him. The woman knew that she had been healed, so she came and she bowed down at Jesus' feet, and she was shaking with fear. And she told Jesus the story, and he said to her, "Dear woman, you are made well because you believe. Go in peace, and you will not have this suffering anymore." While Jesus was standing there speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus and the synagogue leader, and they said, "Your daughter is dead. There's no need to bother the teacher anymore." But Jesus didn't care what the men had said. He said to the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Jesus let only Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, go with him to the synagogue leader's house, where Jesus saw many people crying loudly, and there was a lot of confusion. He entered the house and said, "Why are you people crying? You're making so much noise. This child is not dead. She's only sleeping." But everyone laughed at him. Jesus told the people to leave the house. Then he went into the room where the child was, and he brought the child's mother and father and his 3 followers into the room. And Jesus held the little girl's hand and said to her, "Little girl, I tell you, stand up." And immediately she stood up and began to walk. She was 12 years old, and the mother, the father, and the followers were truly amazed. She gave the mother and father very strict orders not to tell people about this, and then he told them to get her something to eat. May God add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of his word. This scripture is called the sandwich technique. You can see there's a story that gets started, then right in the middle of it there's another story, and then the first story ends. Mark, the gospel writer, uses this technique quite often in his writings. Jairus is the leader of the synagogue, a man of influence and prestige. Now, the synagogue was a gathering of people, but it was also a place for gathering, a place of assembly. It was used as a school. It was a place where they gathered to have meals together. It was used as a court for law, a place to collect and distribute charitable goods, a place for political meetings, and of course, a place for worship. The leader of the synagogue was appointed by the elders to look after the building, to take care of all its contents and arrange and schedule all the meetings. So Jairus' job was very intense. So we look at this story through this man's eyes, a man that goes from desperation to total relief. I can just see Jairus being the first person there as Jesus got off his boat and he fell at his feet and he just begs Jesus to come and heal his daughter. Of course, without delay, Jesus said, "Yes, let's go." But can you imagine the crowd around Jesus and Jairus as they leave and they take off? They're trying to make their way to his house. There's Jesus' followers, not just the 12 apostles, but probably 100 or so of followers. There's friends there for Jairus to lend him support. There are onlookers there who, because, hey, this is the guy that does miracles, I want to see one. And also, this is the guy that gives out free fish, and I'm hungry. Jairus and his friends are pushing people aside and shouting, "Let us through, let us through." Maybe there were even others there that wanted to be healed. But regardless, the crowd refused to be left behind, and they followed along. And then we meet the woman whose desperation was no less or no greater than Jairus'. A woman who for 12 years had hemorrhaged. Her suffering was much more than physical, though. It had been, which would have been enough. She suffered as much from her cures as she did from her case of bleeding. There's an old historical writer called Pliny, and I think there were 2 of them, Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger, that writes about the low condition of the medical profession in the world at that time. The physicians prescribed things like doses of concoctions made of ashes of burned wolf's skull, stag horns, head of mice, eyes of crabs, owl brains, livers of frogs, and other such elements. I don't believe I'd want to have been sick then. For dentistry problems, they were powdered horses' teeth that were administered. And if you had a head cold, they recommended that you kiss a mule. To add insult to injury, this woman was subjected to tremendous social pressures. Because of her condition, she was declared unclean. She had been an outcast for 12 years. No religious worship. No public contact with anyone. Because she would defile them if she came in contact with them. Apparently, she was forced to be separated from her family because no one is mentioned. And she had used all her money on these so-called cures that these doctors prescribed. No relief. This unnamed woman, like Jarvis, heard Jesus was back in their region and set out to find healing and relief through his power. For 12 years, she had been conditioned because of her rejection and isolation. She did not dare approach Jesus and ask for a miracle because she would defile everyone she touched. The best she could hope for is a secret healing. I don't want to bother Jesus. I just need to touch the hem of his garment, then fade back into the mob of people who were pushing and shoving to see him. As soon as she touched Jesus, she was healed. Jesus stopped. Can you imagine Jarvis's reaction when Jesus stopped? And Jesus looked around and said, "Who touched my garments?" I can hear Jarvis say, "Are you kidding me? What do you mean, who touched her garments? Come on, we have to go." Even his own followers questioned him about who touched your garments. Can't you see this entire crowd of people? Everyone is touching you. Jesus knew, and the woman knew that he knew, so she comes forward, bows at his feet. To me, this is one of the most tender moments in the Gospels. This woman is scared to death. She is desperate. She's at the end of her rope. Jesus just says, and I learned this morning in Sunday school that he probably just whispered this to her. And I kind of agree. Because of your faith, go in peace. You are healed. Now, everybody who's in Sunday school is supposed to be nodding your head right now. It's like I told you. None of you are. So back to Jarvis and the followers, and the crowd couldn't understand what this unnecessary delay was. Jarvis was fit to be tied. Why is this so necessary? Why we need to go. And then Jarvis's world came crashing down. The word came, your daughter is dead. All hope swept away. Of course, Jesus just ignored these words and told Jarvis, don't be afraid any longer, just believe. They finally arrived at Jarvis's house, and Jesus left the crowd, taking only Peter, James, and John. Inside, there were a commotion of a funeral already begun. And Jesus saw this and said, this is all unnecessary. She's just asleep. They laughed at him. And then another simple and tender moment, with just some soft, kind words, Jesus took the girl's hand. She stood and was alive. So what's the lesson in us? What's the lesson for us in this story? That's really a story about the grace of Jesus Christ is available, readily available for everyone, from the leader of the synagogue, the most important person there, to this outcast woman, and everyone in between. His grace is available. Max Lucado wrote, long before you knew you needed grace, your Father had you covered. Christ died for us while we were still sinners, it says in Romans 5:8. Before you needed a Savior, you had one. And when you asked him for mercy, he answers, I've already given it, dear child. I've already given it. Philip Yancey says, grace does not depend on what we have done for God, but rather what God has done for us. Ask people what they must do to get to heaven, and most reply, be good. Jesus' stories contradict that answer. All we must do is cry, help. Both Jarvis and the lady in our story, just like us, we cry help. And Jesus says, have faith. Jesus does not say, you're healed, now go and relax and enjoy your life. To do so ignores the realization of life. What Jesus does to the woman, the little girl, and us is gives us peace to the life that he gave us. See, the encounter with Jesus was more important than the cure of these two people. Amen.